Mom was baking in the kitchen. She always made apple pie this time of year. It was a tradition we had since I was welcomed into the family at the age of 7. I loved helping, cutting up each crimson apple with care. I liked to make the slices paper thin, and I bit my lip in concentration as I worked the knife in a steady rhythm. Slice, 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 thud. That last noise startled me, and I spun. Mom was on the floor, as still as the grave. Her eyes glassed over, and I saw a trickle of blood spill down her lips, redder than the apple one still clutched in my hand. It was so sudden, I couldn't shout for help. I couldn't even breathe. A shadow passed over her unmoving form, and I looked up. A young girl was standing over my mother. She looked to be about 9 years old, and her chestnut hair fell down past her shoulders. Her skin was sallow, and she had dark circles under her eyes. I wanted to tell her to run, to go get help, but before I could talk, she looked right into my eyes and spoke. "Go home." I woke up in a cold sweat and briefly forgot where I was. My eyes panned the unfamiliar room, adjusting to the soft moonlight streaming through the windows. I was in Pepper's apartment. I remembered finally, curled up on her couch. Craning my neck, I saw Ryan sprawled out on the adjacent couch, snoring softly. I knew he was asleep, but I still whispered loudly, "Hey, Ryan." No answer. A bit louder. "Ryan, you awake?" I heard an intake of breath as Ryan woke up. He rolled over, almost falling right off the couch, and said, Case, what's up?" I had a bad dream. "Everything's okay now, go back to sleep," he mumbled. The image of my mother lying on the floor, with that girl standing over her, was burned into my head. The girl didn't look too creepy in the dream, but thinking about it now, I got a more sinister vibe. I could clearly remember her face, which was strange because faces were usually pretty blurry in my dreams. She looked so familiar, but I didn't recognize her as anyone I knew in real life. I dismissed the thought as I remembered something else. We never picked my car up, I recalled. It's still parked outside that guy's house. I hope it hasn't been towed. "We'll pick it up in the morning. Now get some rest." Pepper woke us up a few hours later with a bright, cheery smile. She'd already started cooking omelets, so I threw on a bathrobe and offered to help. I liked Pepper. She was fun, lively, and extremely generous. I mean, Ryan and I had been staying with her for half a week already, and she made me feel right at home. Ryan wasn't too fond of her, though. I was pretty out of it the first day we came here, but from what Ryan told me, Pepper and her co-workers are into some shady stuff. Especially Pepper's boss, Calvin. I have a lot to thank them for, though, and so far Pepper and I have been getting along like sisters. "Can we go pick my car up today?" I asked as I turned the flames down on the stove. "Actually, I had something else in mind," Pepper said. "Since you're feeling better, I thought we'd all stop by my work. I already told Calvin we'd be there." Oh, neat, I thought. Pepper had explained that Calvin was a collector of paranormal objects, and his company was a developer of products used to protect people from the occult. I hadn't heard of the company name before, and I don't think he'd want me to write it here, but it's a branch of a well-known manufacturer. I'd been hoping we'd get to learn more about it. "We can go get your car afterwards," Pepper added, and we sat down for breakfast. The three of us arrived at the office just before noon. I was surprised that it looked like a normal workplace, at least as far as I could tell. There was a kind, older woman at the reception desk who greeted Pepper by name as we walked past. We strolled down the cozy, carpeted hallway, past conference rooms and offices. Ryan hung back a bit as we strolled down the hallway, and I could tell he was on edge. I think he blamed himself for putting me in danger and now wished we would just be rid of these phenomena once and for all. Pepper had explained to me that it was very likely Ryan or I were somehow attracting these experiences, and just trying to ignore them was futile. "It's not your fault," she'd said to the both of us, "although you may have made it worse by trying to help other people. Even so, in all likelihood you could have been sucked into these situations regardless." We stopped outside an office. I peered in and saw Calvin sitting at his desk, rummaging through paperwork. He looked up as we entered the room and smiled. "Welcome," he said, standing up from his desk. He turned towards me. "Glad to see you're doing better. I have a lot of questions for you, but first, allow me to show you around." Calvin led us to a locked and bolted door at the end of the hall. He punched in a code, turned a key, and soon I found myself in slick, modern hallway, the fluorescent light shining off the polished, white linoleum. I could see into the nearest room. A few men and women in white lab coats bustled around various high-tech looking equipment. Ryan nudged me and said, "That's Dr. Levine." He was pointing at one of the men in the room, an older gentleman. I'd only met Dr. Levine when I was completely out of it, so I barely remembered him at all. The doctor spotted us and gave a friendly wave. I shyly waved back before Calvin led us past that room and deeper into his laboratory. I'll have to leave out the details of the tour. Calvin had us sign everything short of our basic human rights away. It seems secrecy is a huge deal to them. I probably shouldn't be writing any of this here, but I don't think they know about these posts. Half of what I saw I didn't understand anyway. By the end of the tour, however, we ended up in a room full of labeled boxes, jars, and filing cabinets. I realized I was looking at Calvin's collection, or part of it at least. Calvin proceeded to question me about my brushes with the paranormal. Well, they didn't seem like brushes to me, more like head-on collisions. I'd already told everything to Pepper, who'd obviously passed the information on to her boss. Now he wanted even more details. Where was the necklace my aunt had carved for me now? What had Derek done with the lockbox full of teeth? I realized Calvin was looking for more objects to add to his collection. Not that I minded. If I helped him, he would help me. After a couple long hours of questions, I really needed a break. Pepper suggested she, Ryan, and I go grab a late lunch and maybe pick up my car along the way. As we exited the collection room, I peered down the hallway and stopped short. There was a young girl standing in the middle of the hall. She seemed out of place, only because I'd noticed Ryan and I were the youngest people in the whole building so far. I didn't expect to see a kid here. I smiled and waved at the girl, but she just stared in our direction. I turned to Ryan. "Think it's bring your daughter to work day or something?" I asked. What do you mean?" He glanced up and down the hallway. "That girl." I pointed, but stopped when I noticed she was gone. Huh. Weird, I thought, but it didn't seem too strange at the time. We headed back towards the bolted door to the lab, passing by room after room. It seemed like almost everyone had left for the day, or at least stepped out. I wanted to say bye to Dr. Levine, but when we rounded the last corner, I saw the door was closed. I still ran up to the window to peek in and see if he'd left already. The girl was standing in the room, just behind the glass. "Geez," I said, and jumped backwards, my heart pounding. Ryan rushed over to me, asking what was wrong. It was that little girl again, only I trailed off as I realized something seconds late. Her hair. It was the same chestnut color as the girl from my dream. And come to think of it, her face looked so familiar. Calvin had heard me this time and said, "What girl? There shouldn't be any children back here." He sounded annoyed and pulled open the door to the room. "It's empty." Pepper darted in to double check, but sure enough, there was no one in the room. No, I saw her, I swear. My voice was shaking. It was weird. She looked like someone from my dream last night. Calvin looked concerned and asked if I was certain I'd seen someone. I nodded. "Come with me," he said briskly, and led us to an entirely different room. Inside was a wall of televisions, and I realized they showing footage from security cameras all across the lab. There was one security guard watching the TVs, and Calvin asked him to pull up the video from the room we just left. "I saw her in that hallway first, though," I said, pointing to one of the screens. The guard obligingly ran back the tape from that camera instead. After a minute, I saw movement on the screen. It was the four of us walking out of the collection room. I saw myself on camera, talking to Ryan, and then pointing down the hall at nothing. A shudder ran down my spine. "I swear she was there," I said, my voice wavering. I expected everyone to look at me like I was crazy. I must have forgotten who I was dealing with, however, because Calvin just said, "Run it through the filters." As the guard entered some commands on his keyboard, Calvin explained, "We have 3 different feeds running in each location. It's necessary in this business. Some things just don't show up on a regular camera." I watched the screen intently. The image changed drastically. It looked like something from a heat vision camera, I guessed, and it took me a second to make out the hallway again. As my eyes adjusted, I watched the same footage play back, and again, there was no little girl. I sighed. Maybe I was seeing things. But then the image shifted again to a new filter, and everyone gasped. There on the screen, right where I'd been pointing in the security footage, was the girl. The hair rose up on the back of my neck as the girl turned and looked right at the camera. Her mouth was moving, like she was trying to say something. I felt dizzy and turned away as the others rewound the tape to watch it again. My eyes fell on another television screen, the one showing the room where I'd seen the girl a second time. A whiteboard stood in the corner of the room. It had writing on it, but one line stood out clearer than the rest. I squinted and leaned in closer to make out the words. "Go home." Minutes passed, or it could have been as long as an hour. I'd curled up in a chair in the back of the room as I tried to suppress the realization that had just hit me. I tuned the others out. They were in a heated discussion about the girl in the hall. Calvin seemed angry, and Pepper was arguing with him. I hadn't been paying attention, so I didn't hear what their problem was. Finally, Ryan noticed I'd left the conversation, and he came over to sit with me. "There's nothing to be scared about, Casey," he said. "I mean, look at where we are. I bet weird things like this happen every day." That can't be true. Why would Pepper and Calvin be so upset about it? Instead of voicing that thought, I needed to tell Ryan the conclusion I'd come to. "I recognize the girl," I said. "Really? That's great. Who is she? How do you know her? Was she a friend of yours? Did she, die?" He tried to inject some sympathy into that last part, but I could tell he was just burning with curiosity. I shook my head. "When I was little, and I first went to live with my mom and dad, I was lonely. I didn't know any of the kids in the neighborhood, and school hadn't started yet. I had no one to play with, so instead, I had an imaginary friend." Ryan looked confused, so I went on. "Her name was Jodie. She had chestnut hair and fair skin. She was just a bit taller than I was at the time. At least that's how I pictured her. Ryan, that girl in the video." I jabbed my finger at the screen. "That's her. That's Jodie." "Just take me home," I told Pepper. "No, not home. I mean, back to your apartment." We were in the parking lot outside Pepper's work, and she was eyeing me closely. as if I were about to snap. And maybe I was about to snap, but it wasn't because I'd just seen my childhood imaginary friend standing less than 10 feet away from me. No, it was because I was tired, stressed, and just plain sick of everyone fretting over me. "Come eat with us, at least," Ryan said again. He looked worried and reached out a hand towards me. I brushed him off. "There's food at the apartment. Please just drop me off before you pick up the car," I pleaded. "I'll be fine." I didn't feel fine, though. After going through security footage back in the lab, we'd realized I wasn't just seeing things. There was a ghostly girl following me, one who looked exactly like the imaginary friend I'd had as a child. More recently, she'd appeared in a very disconcerting nightmare, one in which my mother had dropped unconscious to the floor. After catching the girl on camera, I'd thought Calvin, Pepper's boss, would have a solution. That's what his work does. After all, they create means of protection against all sorts of paranormal entities. Instead, Calvin had ushered us quickly out of the building with no explanation. I'd wondered what his problem was, but Pepper dodged my questions and said we shouldn't worry about it. We'd just go about our day as usual, grab lunch, pick up my car from the next town over, and go back to the apartment. I wanted to skip those first 2 steps and just curl up on the couch, wallowing in my own misery. Pathetic, I know. "Please," I whined a second time. I almost stamped my feet on the pavement, but decided a temper tantrum wouldn't convince them to leave me on my own. All right, Pepper finally relented, though Ryan still seemed hesitant. I love the guy, but I really didn't need his hovering right then. Pepper dropped me off in front of her building with her spare elevator key. Ryan rolled down his window and I leaned in for a quick kiss. "Call me if you need me," he said. "We'll be back before you know it." As the car pulled away, I belatedly remembered my phone was dead. Had I even charged it since we arrived at Pepper's over half a week ago? I couldn't remember. The past few days had been such a blur. I felt like my life was on hold. I should have called my mom and dad, or my roommate at least. They didn't even know where I was. They must be worried sick. I pushed the thought aside. I had enough to worry about as it was. Pepper's apartment building was slick and modern, although I always got an old-fashioned vibe from the elevator. Maybe it was the dingy carpet inside, or the dim glow of the ceiling light, or the rickety way it slid open when it stopped at a floor. It was one of those elevators that opened up right into the apartment, so you couldn't press any of the buttons unless you had the right key. I turned Pepper's key in the slot and hit 11. The elevator started its slow climb, and I leaned back against the far wall. I thought back to when I was 7, when I first started playing with my imaginary friend, Jodie. We would do everything together. When I'd grab a snack, I'd get an extra plate for Jodie. When I read a book, I'd wait for Jodie to catch up before I turned the page. When I went for a walk around the neighborhood, there was Jodie walking beside me. I remembered now why I'd stopped playing with her. When I told my new mom about Jodie, she was upset. I didn't want her to be mad at me. I wanted her and Dad to like me and be glad they picked me. So I stopped talking to Jodie, and soon enough I'd forgotten all about her. Until now, when she showed up looking not very imaginary anymore. I watched the numbers as the elevator rose. 8, 9, 10. As it neared 11, I took a step forward, ready to enter the apartment. But the elevator didn't stop. I looked up. 12, 13, 14. I was baffled, as I thought Pepper lived on the highest floor. There weren't even any buttons past 11 in the elevator. The lights flickered, and a sense of dread seeped into me, chilling me to the very bone. The elevator ground to a halt, and I glanced back at the display. 16. The doors slid open. I plastered myself against the back wall of the elevator, terrified of what I might see. There was nothing but darkness outside the elevator doors. Not even the dim light on the ceiling penetrated the black. I blinked furiously, begging my eyes to adjust. I hit the close doors button a few times and then 11 again. The doors remained open. My breathing quickened and grew louder, so loud that I worried someone might hear me, and I didn't know who, or what, lived on floor 16. I held my breath, but the sound of breathing continued. From deep in the blackness, I could hear a slow, raspy panting. There was a flicker of light in the darkness, and the room slowly came into focus. I saw a couple chairs, arranged around one bed in the middle of the room. A sheer curtain hung in front of the bed, obscuring it from view. The room was lit, barely, by a single, flickering fluorescent light. The light came from just behind the curtain, creating an ominous glow. The sound of breathing had to be coming from the bed. Was there someone there, just behind the curtain? I heard a slow, steady beeping sound. I wondered if it had just started, or perhaps the beeping had been there the whole time and I'd only just noticed it. It sounded like an EKG, the machine that hospitals use to monitor your heartbeat, but the rhythm was off. Whoever's in the bed could be in trouble, I thought, and against my better judgment, I walked forward, out of the elevator. That's when I noticed the small figure standing at the side of the bed. Jodie. I froze in my steps. Had she seen me? Her face was in shadow, pointed towards the bed. From my new vantage point, I could peer partway around the curtain. There was someone in the bed. I saw the shape of legs under the blanket and an exposed arm lying flat on the bed. Blood was rushing in my ears. I had to get out of there, and fast. I carefully took a step backwards, and at that moment Jodie turned and took a single step towards me. I stopped, and so did Jodie. Her face was still obscured, but I could feel her eyes on me. I took one more deliberate step backwards, and again she mirrored my progress. I froze again. Jodie didn't. She rushed at me, and I spun around, scrambling back towards the elevator. The doors began to close, and I tumbled through them just in time. I collapsed on the floor of the elevator and turned around just in time to see Jodie's pale face staring into the elevator, just before the doors shut completely. In a soft voice, she said, "Go home." I lay on the floor, panting, as the elevator returned to the 11th floor. It dinged, and the doors opened up into Pepper's apartment. I dragged myself out on my hands and knees, crawling towards the bathroom. Pepper kept her salt gel in the medicine cabinet. She'd said it worked better than a regular salt circle. I grabbed the bottle, made my way back into the living room, and encircled the couch with the gel. I finished up the bottle and curled up on the couch under a blanket, hoping Ryan and Pepper would be back soon. A short time later, I heard a tapping noise at the nearest window, like someone on the other side of the glass was trying to get my attention. I almost turned around, before remembering, I'm on the 11th floor. "Go away, Jodie," I muttered. The tapping stopped for a moment, before starting again. "Go away," I said, a bit louder this time. I wrapped my blanket over my head, trying to shut out the noise. Again, the tapping ceased for a brief while. As soon as I let out a sigh of relief, it began. Again, even faster and more urgent than before. "Go away." "Case, are you all right?" Ryan said. I hadn't even heard the elevator open, but when I pulled the blanket off my head, there were my boyfriend and Pepper, standing by the doors. He rushed to my side. "What's wrong? What happened?" He stepped lightly over the salt gel circle and came to my side. I must have looked like a mess huddled under the blanket, my face surely colorless from fright. "I need to go home," I said. I know, he said. "But we need to wait for Calvin to figure everything out. Then we can go home." "No, I need to go home now," I repeated. Jodie told me to. He looked shocked, and I was surprised myself. When had I decided to go home? But I was certain it was the right decision. "Han, you don't have to do what Jodie tells," he began. "Please, just trust me. You don't have to go, just give me the keys." Pepper had been listening in on our conversation and butted in. "You are not going anywhere, and that is final," she said, looking right at me. "Let us figure this out, we know better." I could tell there was no arguing with her, and before I could plead more with Ryan, he got up and left the living room. I was all alone, and I did the only thing I could think to do at the moment. I slept. Mom was in the kitchen, baking apple pie. I was helping her. Only this time I knew I was dreaming. I knew what would happen next. Mom would fall to the floor, unconscious and bleeding. I wanted to warn her, but I couldn't yell or even turn around. I sliced the apples carefully until I heard the thud. I spun around to the familiar scene. Mom lay still on the ground. Jodie was there too, where I expected her to be. She stood over my mother, but before she could speak, I said, "I know. I'm coming." "Wake up," she said. "Wake up." I was jolted out of my dream and almost yelped in surprise when I saw Ryan's face in front of mine. "Wake up," he whispered again. I'm up. It was pitch black outside. "What are you doing?" "You're going home," he said. "Come on." I glanced at my watch. It was 4 a.m. Ryan was dressed and had the car keys in hand. Luckily, I'd never changed out of my clothes the night before, so I jumped up, ready to leave. We took the stairwell, so as not to wake Pepper, and in no time we were on our way. My hometown was a few hours away, so the sun was up by the time we arrived in my neighborhood. Ryan pulled into the cul-de-sac and parked in front of my house. I ran inside before he even had a chance to unbuckle his seatbelt. "Mom? Dad?" I shouted. No answer. I ran into the kitchen and skidded to a halt. On the counter were about a dozen partially sliced apples, all browned as if they'd been left out a long time. A glass pie pan lay shattered on the floor, and near it was that blood. I felt sick to my stomach. "Mom," I shouted again, and again there was no answer. I heard footsteps behind me, and a second later Ryan joined me in the kitchen. He took one look at the mess and guided me away. "Their cars were out front," I said. "They have to be here." I ran outside to double check, and sure enough, both cars were in the driveway. I was bewildered. Where could they be? At that moment, my next-door neighbor come out of the house to grab the newspaper. "Oh, Casey," he said. "I'm so glad you're here. Your dad's been trying to reach you." Relief washed over me before giving way to dread again. "What's wrong?" "Your mother's in the hospital," he explained. "She fainted 2 days ago, but I haven't heard much since then. I'm so sorry." Ryan took down the address of the hospital. I was too numb to process anything. It wasn't a far drive, and we arrived there around 8. I raced to reception, gave my name, and said I was there to see my mom. "Family only," the woman said, so Ryan waited outside. The woman also said visiting hours didn't start for another half hour, so I paced anxiously outside the doors to that wing until I was allowed in. My mother's room number was 16, and I recalled the previous day. The elevator had stopped at 16. I broke into a jog as I neared the room and burst through the door. I wasn't sure what to expect. Maybe my mother lying on her deathbed, feeble and frail. Instead, Mom was propped up in bed eating green jello, with a half-finished crossword puzzle on the tray in front of her. Dad was sprawled out in a chair, fast asleep and snoring. "Casey," Mom said, elated. "We couldn't reach you. I've been worried sick." I rushed over into her embrace, apologies spilling from my lips. I said I was sorry for not calling her, for not telling her where I was and being there when she needed me. She patted my hair and said everything was fine. She was just so glad I was there. She'd collapsed because of an undiagnosed arrhythmic heartbeat and said it was lucky that's all that happened. She'd be all right after treatment. Dad had accompanied her in the ambulance and hadn't left her side since. Now that I was there, he felt okay leaving for a bit. Mom and I sat alone in her hospital room, working on her crossword together. After some time, I said, "Mom?" "Yes, sweetie." "Who's Jodie?" Her breath caught, and I wasn't sure she would answer me for a moment. Then she took a deep breath and said, "Before we adopted you, father and I had another child, a daughter named Jodie. She was ill, and she passed away at the age of 9. We were heartbroken, and it took some time before we were strong enough to have another child. Then we met you. I'll always miss my first daughter, but I was so glad you came into our family. I didn't want you to feel jealous or unloved, so your father and I decided not to tell you about Jodie. I'm sorry if that was a bad decision." "It's fine, Mom, I understand." She paused. "Do you remember when you first came to us? You had an imaginary friend named Jodie. I'd almost forgotten about that. I have to say, it was a little bit shocking for me to hear you talking to Jodie, like she were right next to you. Your friend didn't stick around too long though, did she?" I looked over at Jodie, standing on the opposite side of Mom's bed. She smiled at me, then looked adoringly back at Mom. I smiled too. No, she didn't stick around. I said my goodbyes to Mom and Dad and said I would be in touch and visit if they needed me. Mom hurried me out of the room though, saying I shouldn't be skipping school for her sake. I felt guilty that I couldn't tell her what was actually going on in my life. At least she had Jodie to watch out for her. When I met Ryan outside, he was on the phone. He sounded angry. I raised my eyebrows at him. "What's going on?" He shook his head at me, mouthing nothing good. He hung up the phone without a goodbye. That was Calvin. He said we can't go back there. What? Why? My heart sank. Being with Calvin and Pepper had made me feel safer than I had in weeks. They were going to help me. They'd make these things stop happening. Ryan continued, Jodie should never have appeared in his lab. He said there are too many barriers and defenses to get past. Nothing paranormal gets in or out unless he wants it to. Until you came along. He's scared of whatever it is about you that draws these things in. It's stronger than anything else he's seen. If Calvin's scared, then I should be terrified, I thought. He suggested we keep moving. If we stay in the same spot, we'll be a danger to those around us. We? I thought it was just me. You're not going to face this alone, Ryan said defiantly. I thought about telling him to leave right then. That would have been the smart thing to do. Instead, we walked back to the car hand in hand and drove off.